Sunday.
Mother's Day. Oh, Sunday, yes. It's Sunday. I think we've already had an example of Mother's Day. We've had some beautiful illustrations of what Mother's Day is all about already. But I want to take some time this morning and focus on three women. Sorry, guys. This sermon is going to be about women. But I want to focus on three women and look at the story that they tell us. But there's a couple of things I want to just remind us of first of all. Do any of you, let's see if I can turn this on, because it doesn't work if it's not on. There we go. Any of you remember what that image is? Yeah? Strawberry shortcake? What's the word? Lavished. Some of you are looking at me like, that's really strange. Why would you use the word lavished dealing with strawberries and whipped cream? Well, the reason for that is just a couple Sabbaths ago, I preached about lavished. Have you remembered that word, those of you that were here? Remember what it means? Smothered, covered, loaded up. That's the idea of lavished. I'm going to ask for one more thing. If we can have a stand and I can put this on. Otherwise, you'll see me just shaking away here. It's just who I am. Thank you. Appreciate that. But we talk about that word lavished. And there was another word we used with it. Do you remember what it was? What's the word that went with lavished? Lavished grace. Remember that? Let's see if we can clip this one in. I don't think we can.
Oh, this one is smaller.
Doesn't look like it wants to hold in that.
Yeah, it's too small.
Oh. I guess I'm just going to have to shake. So you'll have to get used to that. If you see me shaking, it's not that I'm saying yes and no. It's just that I'm shaking. And by the way, it doesn't have to do with my nervousness up here. It has to do with something I've had for a long time. It's called essential tremor. So just so you understand, that's what we're talking about. Anyway, lavished. Interesting concept. God's grace poured down upon us, just lavished on us, covered over the top and running down the sides. And then I also used something else because some of you are savory people. Do you remember what that one was? Gravy, yes. On mashed potatoes, poured out, flowing over the sides. What a picture. What happens when we allow God's grace to flow into our lives? What's it like? Well, that's what I want to talk about today. But before I do, I want to share just an interesting thought that I ran across. It's found in the book Steps to Christ. If you ever get a chance to read that book, it is rich. It's a powerful book. And here's what it says. In the matchless gift of his Son, God has encircled the whole world with an atmosphere of grace as real as the air which circulates around the globe. All who choose to breathe this life-giving atmosphere will live and grow up to the stature of men and women in Christ Jesus. I think that is very, very significant, isn't it? How many of you noticed air this morning? Did you think about it? None of you? And you're all breathing it. Grace. God has supplied his grace in the same way as an atmosphere that covers our globe. What a beautiful thought to realize. And as we breathe in that atmosphere, we're changed. I love that thought. Well, I want to look at these stories right now, and there are three women that I'm going to look at. There's a lot more, and even there's men, so men you can go through the Bible and find yourselves described in there as well. But these three women discovered the atmosphere of grace. And I want to talk about these three. Now, just by looking at the pictures, can you figure them out? I think you know one of them already. The last one. But let's take a look. Ruth, Moabite, ancestor of Jesus. Take a look at this, and we're going to see what we can discover about her. Naomi and her daughters-in-law got ready to leave Moab to return to her homeland. But on the way, Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back to your mother's homes instead of coming with me, and may the Lord reward you for your kindness to your husbands and to me. May the Lord bless you with the security of another marriage." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they all broke down and wept. You remember that story? What do we know about Ruth right now? Do we know anything about her? We know one thing. Who was she? A Moabite. Does that make any difference?
Yeah.
It actually does. It's interesting to look at Moabites. Within the Near Eastern area, one of the gifts that most people had was a gift of hospitality. When you happened to be traveling across the desert and you happened to notice a tent, you would go there, and what would you expect? Hospitality. Someone would say, "Do you want a drink of water?" "Yes, by the way, I would like a drink of water," as I'm going across the desert. Hospitality was not a gift of the Moabites. They were not a hospitable group of people. And one other thing, they hated Jews. Didn't like them. They would fight them whenever they got the chance. So here is Ruth, a Moabite. Let's find out more about her. What do we know about her? Well, we know this little bit. She's a Moabite. She comes from a group of people that hate Jews or Israelites. And she's also not very hospitable, according to her origins. Let's find out if that's true. Here's Ruth. Oprah has already said, "Okay, thanks, mother-in-law. I will go back. Don't want to, but I will." And Ruth said, "But do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." Powerful statement that she made. Do you sense any touch of grace already in her life? It's there. She was, and as I looked at her story, these were some of the things I discovered. Looking at that idea of grace. Here's grace in action. She was willing to show love and respect to her mother-in-law when those traits were not part of her inherited nature. She wasn't necessarily a warm person. At least she didn't come from a climate where warm was loved. But she showed it. It came out in her life. Willing to glean from the fields when she had previously known wealth. As I was reading through some information, some of the old history, some of the Jewish writers, they described Ruth as possibly coming from the king's household, one of the king's daughters in Moab. So here she is, knowing wealth and willing to go out into the fields and glean. Willing to bring back the gleanings to her mother-in-law when she could have stashed some of it away all by herself. Just taking care of herself, but no, she didn't. Willing to follow the advice of her elders, even when she had been a wife herself. She had already been married, but she was willing to listen. We find grace showing up in different ways in her life. Willing to say to Boaz, I'm your servant. That's interesting. But she was willing to say that to him. But probably the most significant thing that I have found as I looked at this story is the concept that the book of Ruth teaches us, the concept of kinsman redeemer. What does that mean? What does that describe when we talk about kinsman redeemer? That's a picture that's used of Jesus. What does it describe? Well, first of all, kinsman, someone who's part of our family, someone we're related to. How does that fit with Jesus? Was he willing to step into our world and say, I will be your kinsman? He was. God stepped into our world and said, I want to be part of your family. I want you to understand me as part of your family. Redeemer, willing to buy back what we've sold with no gain to himself. We find that described in Isaiah 53, where it talks about how he was willing to give up his life. The sins that we had, he took on himself so that we would have his righteousness. No gain to him, but a powerful concept of that kinsman redeemer. A picture of our God willing to step into our world, buying us back from a life of slavery to sin, and then bringing us back into his world. Stepping from heaven down to my world, and then taking my hand and taking me back. What a picture of a kinsman redeemer. And that's what Ruth gives us in this story. So, I have to ask the question, I wonder if they would have called her Grace. I think they could have. I think they named her Grace. I want to look at one other story. I told you there's three, so you're going to have to wait for one more after this. I want to tell you one other story here. The Canaanite woman and her daughter. Now, once again, we don't know a lot about this. It's a very short section in Scripture. Very small picture of this woman. Found in Matthew chapter 15 and reading onwards. And let's look at that story. Let's see what we find out about her. Behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon. So what do we know about her? Anything? She's a Canaanite. Okay? That tells us something. She's a mother. That tells us something. She's got a daughter that's sick. That tells us something. What do we know about the Canaanites? Who were they? In fact, if you read this section in Mark, it talks about her as being Syro-Phoenician. And that doesn't help us a whole lot. It's not a term we use these days, is it? I don't think you've ever called someone a Syro-Phoenician before. What does it mean? Well, what it was really saying, now remember who's with Jesus right now? His disciples. They're walking with him. All of a sudden this woman comes up to her. She's a Canaanite. She's a Syro-Phoenician. Don't waste a miracle on her. She's not worth it. She's not one that you want to have around you. You don't even want to talk to her because you might just get, well, as kids used to say, cooties. You might just get something that you don't want. Something that you might be called unclean. And so Jesus responds in a very interesting way to this woman. Interesting to look at. So that's what we know about her. Not a whole lot. She's a Canaanite. She's a woman. She's a mother. Here's Jesus' response. He didn't say anything. He didn't respond. And the disciples turned to him and said, "Get rid of her. Send her away. Don't waste miracles on her." And he responded, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered her, "It's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Ouch. What would happen if someone said that to you? So you're calling me a dog? Is that what you're doing? It was a terrible thing to say. But somehow Jesus was trying to get across to his disciples, you're thinking of her as a dog. She's not. But that's your view of her. Interesting that I noticed this in Desire of Ages says, this was virtually asserting that it was not just or fair to lavish the blessings brought to the favored people of God upon strangers and aliens from Israel. This answer would have utterly discouraged a less earnest seeker, but the woman saw that her opportunity had come. Beneath the apparent refusal of Jesus, she saw compassion that he could not hide. Beautiful picture. Even though he was using these words that he knew the disciples would have loved to use, he wasn't. Behind that, she sensed his love. She sensed his desire to provide a miracle. She said, "Yes, Lord. Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall off their master's table." I love her response. Such a powerful response. In fact, it's interesting as I'm reading some of the history around this, some theologians think she was just loving the bantering between her and Jesus. I don't think so. I think she saw his love. I think she sensed that grace that enveloped the world. And she took a breath of that grace and she said, "I want it. I need that for myself. I need that for my daughter." When the children of the household eat at the Father's table, even the dogs are not left unfed. They have a right to the crumbs that fall to the table abundantly supplied. So while there were many blessings given to Israel, was there not also a blessing for her? She was looked upon as a dog. And had she not then a dog's claim to a crumb from his bounty? And that's what she claimed. And it's so beautiful to watch Jesus' response. Because yes, that compassion was shining through his face. And here was his response. Then Jesus answered her, "O woman, great is your faith. Be it done to you as you desire." And her daughter was healed instantly. Where did she get that faith from? How would she have understood that about Jesus? Well, maybe she heard some of the stories. We don't know. We don't know what she heard. We don't know what had been going on in the background, where she had picked up stories. Maybe she heard about the 10 demoniacs, or not demoniacs, the lepers. And maybe she heard that one of them came back, and that one of them was a Gentile. Maybe she heard about that Samaritan woman that Jesus had come to, and the whole town had turned to him. Somewhere she had picked up grace from Jesus. And because of that grace, she knew that if she could get to Jesus, she could get the healing that she needed for her daughter. And again, well, as this verse says, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word of Christ. Faith comes. Faith is not something that we all of a sudden have. Faith is something that we've experienced and we've tasted it and we like it and it's solid and we want more of it. Faith, well, let me just put it this way. Simple illustration, but I noticed that all of you sat down when Brother Bruno told you to. How many of you knew that you could trust those chairs you were sitting on? Previous experience. You knew you could trust the chair, and you all just sat down just as comfortable as could be. Faith comes from discovering that you can trust Jesus. And as you learn to trust him, you trust him more and more. And so this woman had come to the point of understanding that she could rest in Jesus. And when she came to him, even if he said words that she didn't fully understand, but I think those disciples discovered what she was saying, she was able to keep on talking with him, and she sensed that grace, that peace. She had breathed in that atmosphere of grace. And I think we could call her name Grace as well. Last one. This one was interesting for me. I went through a lot of verses in the Bible, and I'll share some of what I found. Mary of Bethany, a.k.a. Mary Magdalene, a.k.a. Mary of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. It doesn't always put those three together. And yet, as you look at all the verses, it becomes clearer and clearer that yes, we're talking about the same woman. So what do we know about her? What do you know about Mary? Well, we know quite a bit, actually. There are more illustrations and verses in the Gospels talking about Mary than just about any other woman in the Bible. First of all, she's a sister of Martha and Lazarus. How do we know that? You remember what happened when Lazarus died and Jesus came. And who did he call for? Mary and Martha, sisters. It describes it there. Then we know that she sat at Jesus' feet. And I love that illustration. It's just such a perfect one. Here's Martha trying to prepare for 13 hungry men. Where would you be if you had 13 hungry men show up at your house? In the kitchen, working and stirring and mixing. And Martha comes in and discovers Mary is there at the knees, at the feet of Jesus. And Martha says, Jesus, can't you tell her to come into the kitchen with me? But the Lord said to her, my dear Martha, you're so upset about all these details. Shouldn't she have been? I think so, possibly. There is really only one thing worth being concerned about. And Mary has discovered it, and I won't take it away from her. What had she discovered? She had received a breath of that grace that was swirling all around the world, that encompassed the world. She had received a breath of that, and she wanted more. She had to have more. So we know that about her. We also know about this interesting story. Remember what the story was all about? There's Mary, or actually there's Jesus. He's over at Simon's place. Simon is a Pharisee. But if you look at all of the stories, Simon was also a leper. He had been a leper. He was a Pharisee. Well, that's quite a jump, if you understand. Leprosy said, stay away from everyone. Pharisees said, you are the best of everything. And so Simon decided it would be nice to have a feast and have Jesus there. And you know what would really add a nice little touch to this? Is have Lazarus there. He's just been raised from the dead. Well, this is going to be a real feast. And let's get Martha. She needs to be in the kitchen. It's all in the story. And then in comes Mary. What does she do? She takes an alabaster box of pure nard, one of the sweetest smelling perfumes, and she breaks it open, thinking she's doing it all by herself and no one's going to notice. But have you ever noticed what happens when someone's wearing strong perfume? Everybody knows about it, don't they? She breaks it open and she washes his feet and she anoints his head. And Jesus makes a comment in that feast that this is the nicest thing that was ever done to him, and it's going to be remembered all over the world. 4 different places we find this picture of what's taking place. It was the love of Christ that constrained her. The matchless excellence of the character of Christ filled her soul. That anointment was a symbol of the heart of the giver. It was the outward demonstration of a love fed by heavenly streams until it overflowed. Where have you heard that concept of overflowing? Lavished. That's right. Grace lavished in our life overflows. It flows to others. They too experience that grace through us. Now, I'm going to touch on something rather interesting here, and that is that she was the ex-girlfriend of Simon the Pharisee, aka Simon the leper. Now, how'd I ever put that together? Simon makes an interesting comment. If you read the story in Luke, you find that the Pharisee makes a comment about this woman. How did Simon know that she was a great sinner? How did he come to think of her in that way? Well, again, Desire Ages brings out an interesting thought. Simon had led into sin the woman he now despised. She had been deeply wronged by him. Simon knew that Mary was a sinner. He knew she was a sinner because he was the one that had taken her there. And likely what happened, if I try to put the pieces together of this story, remember Mary Magdalene? Do you remember what it says about her, what had happened to her previously? Jesus had done something unique with her. He had cast out 7 devils in her life. Mary from Bethany probably was engaged or dating Simon. That would be just a good combination, wouldn't it? You know, here's a beautiful person, and here's an up-and-coming Pharisee. You can't ask for a better combination. And somehow Simon didn't treat her right. Destroyed her reputation. And if we understand what happens in the Bible, when you understand why Joseph didn't want to take Mary to be his wife, it was because the community would look at that woman as being sinful because she was no longer a virgin and she wasn't married. I believe that what happened with Mary was exactly the same thing. And what could she do? What were the results of that type of a lifestyle? Well, in Judean culture, it was stoning. Get rid of her. And I suspect she probably ran. Magdala is over by the ocean. It's an area where fishermen would bring in their catches. And so she was able to be over there and live her life. Destroyed by Simon. Interesting to look at what Jesus did to bring this out. What did he say? Simon, I've got to tell you a story. Someone owed someone 5,000, whatever it was, denarius. And another person owed 50,000. And the owner forgave all of that. Who's going to love him most? And Simon had to walk into that, knowing that he was setting himself up as the one who was being forgiven the least, because he wasn't willing to be forgiven. So here we find this about Simon the leper. She had 7 demons cast out of her. Jesus had given her a breath of that atmosphere that surrounds the world. She had had a taste of that grace. Now we understand why she was at Jesus' feet. Because she knew where that grace came from. She knew that was the thing that was most important in her life. She had to have that grace. And we're not finished with her. What we read this morning in our scripture reading, what did it tell us about Mary? She was the first one to see Jesus resurrected. I love that thought. You see, she had discovered this grace. She had discovered this experience with Jesus. And Jesus even waited before he went to heaven so that Mary could see him. I love that picture. Oops, I didn't want to do that. She was also the first evangelist. Thought of that? You see, she was the one that got to share Jesus' lavish love. When you look at the picture, she was the first one that saw that the grave was empty and that Jesus was alive. And she had the privilege of then sharing that picture. She was the first one to share a glimmer of hope with a bunch of disciples that were scared out of their minds and hiding in the upper room, keeping the doors locked, just in case. She was the one that was able to come in. And lastly, she was the one that was the first to lavish grace on Peter. Remember what it says? Go tell my disciples and Peter. She had the privilege of sharing that picture of Jesus. Why do you think Jesus wanted her to do that? Why do you think Christ wanted her to do that? Because she understood that atmosphere of grace. She had taken a breath and realized, I want to keep breathing this for the rest of my life. And that's exactly what happened. So, I think I'm comfortable changing her name to Grace, just as I am with the other two women. And you know, it's true that even now, each of us can have our names changed to Grace as well. Because we can have that privilege of sharing that atmosphere of grace that covers the world. 3 women, they all discovered the atmosphere of grace. What would happen to us if we were to experience that grace as well?